Our interceptors met the European vanguard halfway between Earth and the edge of the asteroid belt, just within the orbital path of Mars. On my tactical display, the cascade of dark green triangles that represented the enemy vanguard began to slow its speed as it closed in on our forces, represented by an arrowhead-shaped mass of white triangles racing to meet it. There were a great deal more green triangles than white ones. But with the fearlessness of drone pilots, we continued to charge forward, straight toward our advancing enemy, until we were just within visual contact. Then, at my father's order, we all slammed on our brakes, and our wing came to a collective drifting stop. "Bad guys at 12 o'clock, my father announced over the comm. "Fangs out. Prepare to engage as soon as we're within range." You can bet they will. A collective reply of "Weapons hot" echoed over the comm channel. There they were, an impossibly vast swarm of glaive fighters arrayed in a protective grid-like shield around the massive dreadnought sphere, gleaming in their midst. The warped reflection of the star field streaking across its chromed surface as they hurtled toward us. The disruptor had yet to be deployed. It was still concealed inside the armored skin of the dreadnought sphere, along with hundreds of thousands of troop ships carrying millions of ground force drones. "Well, hello there," I heard my father say over the comm. "This is General Xavier Lightman of the Earth Defense Alliance. Where do you assholes think you're headed?" After a pause, he added, "Klaatu Barada Nikto, fellas." Then, perhaps taking his own stab at some gallows humor, he whistled the 5-note message used to communicate with the friendly ETs in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the same tones that bookended each of the Europans' montage transmissions. The only response to my father's whistled entreaty came a few tense heartbeats later, when the spearhead of glaive fighters leading the vanguard finally came within range of our ships and opened fire on us. The black void around us erupted in a deluge of crisscrossing blue plasma bolts and streaks of red laser fire as ships on both sides broke formation to attack. Our interceptors returned fire, and then the ships began exploding above and below me to port and starboard, aft and stern, lighting up the mirror surface of my interceptor in a horrific light show. A similar cascade of contained atomic explosions began to light up the enemy ranks out in front of me, like tangled chains of Christmas tree lights being switched on only to short out a second later. I aimed my rocket 88 right into the torrent of enemy fighters and fanned the trigger on my flight stick to fire off a rapid volley of plasma bolts. The glaives were packed so tightly in front of me that it seemed difficult to miss, and for a few seconds I felt invincible and unstoppable, like I was using the Force. But then I was passing through the cloud of arcing, swooping glaive fighters, evading their laser and plasma fire, which I did reflexively, almost without thinking, and I smiled because everything had become clear once again, now that I was finally facing off against my true enemy. The doubt and uncertainty my father had planted in my mind were gone. So was the lead ball of fear in my gut. Now, all that remained was primal territorial rage and the clear sense of purpose that came with it. Kill or be killed, conquer or be conquered, survive or go extinct. These were not difficult decisions. In fact, the answers were hardwired into the human brain. The only thing I could think was, now for wrath, now for ruin, and a red nightfall. I continued slicing my interceptor through the enemy's ranks at sharp right angles, firing first, then moving, and always firing at the shifting patterns of targets cascading across my HUD, overlaying the folding formations of glaive fighters in front of my ship, which moved just like they had always moved in our old Armada and Terra Firma missions. I began to slip into the zone, the old familiar rhythm I would sometimes fall into when I played Armada, where everything just seemed to click. With the help of the music in my headphones, I'd locked into the enemy's patterns of movement, their little digital idiosyncrasies that allowed me to anticipate their attacks and evasive maneuvers. I was on fire. I couldn't seem to miss. While at the same time, nothing could seem to hit me. For a few seconds, it felt just like playing Armada back home. Why would real aliens behave exactly like video game simulations of themselves? The question kept trying to worm its way into my thoughts, but I wouldn't let it. I focused on the bliss of battle instead. Our interceptors were getting picked off fast, but the first of our reinforcement drones were already arriving. Each time one of our drones was destroyed, its operator took control of another interceptor inside the reserve hangar at Moonbase Alpha and flew back to rejoin the battle as quickly as they could. Thankfully, the trip back to the battlefront was growing shorter every second because the Vanguard was still moving forward, still closing in on Earth. We were losing ships fast. If it hadn't been obvious before, it definitely was now. We were fighting a war of attrition. We weren't going to be able to stop the Vanguard, not by a long shot. The Vanguard was moving too fast, and it was mowing down everything we put in its path. We were only going to make a small dent in their forces before they reached Earth, if that. I took out 7 enemy ships before my first drone got waxed. The handful of minutes it took my second drone to get back in the shit seemed to stretch on for hours. Once I finally reached the enemy's ever-encroaching front line and re-engaged with the Vanguard, I got nailed by an overloading glaive reactor core on my way in and was blasted to bits once again, this time without scoring a single enemy kill. As my third interceptor rocketed out of the drone hangar, a warning began to flash on my HUD, informing me that the enemy was already closing in on the far side of the moon. A second later, I saw them falling toward me, straight out of the black lunar sky above, thousands upon thousands of them filling the horizon. "The Vanguard is splitting up," my father said over the intercom, "dividing itself in two. It looks like the half containing the disruptor is headed for Earth." "And the other half is headed here," Shin added. I checked my tactical display. They were right. The Vanguard had split itself in two, like an amoeba, creating 2 torpedo-shaped clusters of roughly equal size. One cluster had the disruptor decahedron at its center. The other was closing in on us. On my tactical display, the deluge of green triangles began to rain down on the base, like lava erupting from some Olympian volcano anchored in the stars above. "Moonbase Alpha is under attack," my computer helpfully informed me. "Warning!" An ear-splitting klaxon began to wail over the base intercom. "Knock, knock," Graham shouted over the comm. "Our guests have arrived. And they never seemed this pissed off on any of their previous visits. Check the topside feeds." I flipped off my VR goggles and for a moment and tapped a small security camera icon on my QCOM. A dozen thumbnail windows filled its display, each showing a different camera feed from the base. The exterior of the base was crawling with enemy drones, so covered by attackers that it looked like some otherworldly anthill being invaded by a neighboring colony of metal insects. In the background, other dropships, continued to make landfall, opening up like metal flowers as they hit the lunar surface, allowing thousands of spider fighters and basilisks to pour out and join the swelling army of alien drones already descending on the base. "Welcome wagon activated," my father announced. The base's automated sentry guns sprang to life and began to unload a steady barrage at the hundreds of glaive fighters descending on the base like angry hornets. The fighters' first volley of plasma bombs detonated against the base's defense shields. The explosion erupted and crackled across the shield's transparent surface as its energy was deflected back out into space, creating a dazzling light show across the display over our heads, briefly lighting up the darkened Thunderdome. The accompanying transfer of energy shook the entire base and the lunar surface beneath it. As the moonquake, my first, subsided, I had to resist a panicked urge to scramble out of my control pod and run to safety, wherever the hell that might be. Instead, I gripped my flight stick even more tightly, pulling my newly launched reserve interceptor into a steep climb, and firewalled the throttle, blasting straight upward into the deluge of glaive fighters descending toward me. Other drones were launching and forming up below me, adding their fire to mine. I took out 5 more enemy fighters, then a 6th and a 7th. My comrades were doing equally well when I heard Debbie mutter, "Easy as can be easy," to herself over the comm. Then, just as I was swinging my crosshairs over my next target, a hail of enemy laser fire finally converged on my drone from several different angles, and it was blasted to smithereens. I cursed and took control of another ship, but before I could even launch it, the enemy ships had reached the surface and blasted their way into the base's drone hangar. When I fired the launch release on my drone, nothing happened, because the catapult mechanism had already been blasted in half. As the towers of unused drones around me began to crumble and collapse, my display flashed bright white. At the same moment, I heard a thunderous booming explosion up on the surface, followed by a shock wave that shook the Thunderdome violently. I opened the canopy of my pod and stuck my head up, then looked around. One at a time, the others emerged too. "Damn," my father said, far too calmly for my liking. "One of them breached the hangar defenses and self-destructed. The whole place went up, along with all of our remaining reserve drones." "What are we supposed to do now?" Debbie asked, echoing my own thoughts, though she sounded a lot calmer than I was currently feeling. "The EDA is sending more interceptors from Earth," Shin told us, "but they're all going after the disruptor. We're probably on our own from here now." He and my father exchanged a brief glance before the general turned to address the rest of us. "Everyone get back in your pods now," my father shouted. "Shin will give each of you control of one of the base's laser sentry turrets. Try to keep as many of them from advancing down here to the op center for as long as you can. Hold them back, okay?" Before he'd even finished speaking, I leaped down into one of the dual aethid controller rigs he'd constructed and powered it on. He slipped his hands into its power gauntlets, and the display screens around him lit up simultaneously. Another violent tremor shook the Thunderdome as we all scrambled back into our control pods. As the canopy closed and settled back into my seat, a simplified HUD appeared on my screens, laid over a high-definition video feed from one of the base sentry turrets, along with a targeting reticle, a rangefinder, and a power meter for its laser cannon. "Keep firing," my father said. "Hold them back as long as you can." I picked off as many drones as I could, but they just kept coming in a never-ending assault. Within a few minutes, the inevitable happened. A group of drones concentrated their laser fire on the hangar airlock long enough to break through the blast doors to the corridor beyond. The enemy now had free run of the base. "Breach! That's a breach!" Shin shouted over the comm channel. "They're inside the base. I can see them on levels 5 and 6, and they're already making their way down here. Mostly spider fighters. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them." We all remained inside our control pods, each of us now taking control of an aethid in different locations throughout the base. I don't know about the others, but I was getting my ass kicked. Each time I took control of a new aethid, it was torn apart by spider fighters even more quickly than the last. "Okay," my father said. "Abandon stations. We're evacuating right now." "Chen, Wody, Zack, do I have to pull you guys up out of there? Because I will. Come on, we're leaving." I scrambled up out of my pod just in time to see my father make good on his promise. He reached down and grabbed Wody around the waist and then lifted her up out of her pod away from the controls. My father passed her off to Debbie, then turned around and prepared to do the same thing to Chen, who complied on his own at the last second. Leaping out of his pod like Superman, then snapping the general a salute as he landed on the deck in front of him. "Sir, yes, sir!" Chen shouted. Shin remained inside of his pod. I ran over to check the pod display screens. He was operating a whole squadron of aethids posted outside the turbo elevator shaft leading down to the Thunderdome. On the security camera feeds, we could see an angry horde of spider fighters in the process of breaking down the armored door that now separated them from our current location. Each time they slammed into it, we could hear the muted, repetitive clanking transmitted through the stone walls around us. When he saw that Shin wasn't leaving, Milo jumped back into his own pod, saying, "Shin and I will hold them off, then we'll catch up with you." My father opened his mouth to protest, but another explosion shook the base, cutting him off. Graham shouted both their names over his shoulder and headed for the exit. "You're already wasting seconds, General," Shin said. "Milo and I can hold them off a lot longer than the automated sentry systems, but if you don't leave now, you'll never make it." "Go ahead, sir," Milo shouted over his comlink. "We got this." While he deliberated with my father, Shin was dragging the fingers of both of his hands across the screens in front of him, highlighting groups of drones and assigning them to attack certain enemies or defend certain sections of the base. I could see him struggling to effectively manage the base's dwindling defense resources. All the while, he was simultaneously controlling half a dozen aphids, fighting alongside the other infantry drones controlled by the operators back on Earth, who weren't nearly as skilled or lethal. Shin glanced over at Graham, then back at my father. Something unspoken passed between the three men. Then my father nodded, and his fingers began to dance across the control panels in front of him. "I'm setting all of the unmanned sentry guns to auto-fire," he said, then turned and ran towards the exit. "The rest of you follow me. Now, hurry!" He tapped the Q-com on his wrist, and a hidden door opened in the curved stone wall, opposite the entrance, revealing a narrow staircase. The six of us sprinted down it, just as another series of tremors rocked every level of the moon base. The staircase led down to a large cube-shaped room with a pressurized hatch embedded in its stone floor. There was a rack of visored space helmets mounted on the wall, and my father ordered each of us to put one on before donning one himself. After I put mine on, I felt the helmet retract in size slightly to form an airtight seal around my face just below the chin line. Then a HUD appeared, superimposed on the interior of my visor. The atmospheric readings and gauge for the small oxygen tanks mounted in its collar. Once Graham made sure everyone had their helmets on properly, my father pressed his palm to the scanner beside the hatch, which hissed open, revealing the interior of a tube-shaped capsule about the size of a VW microbus, with 10 passenger seats inside. Through the capsule's porthole windows, we could see that it was nestled inside a spherical underground tunnel, like a bullet inside the barrel of a gun. Once we strapped ourselves in, my father smacked the red button mounted on the bulkhead, and the capsule rocketed forward, pressing each of us back into our seats. As our capsule hurtled through the darkened tunnel, we could hear Milo and Shin shouting a mix of insults and words of encouragement at each other over our Q-coms as the two of them continued to hold the spider fighters at bay. "The base is completely overrun," Shin told us over the comm. "Every level. They're concentrating outside the Thunderdome now. They'll break inside any second." "Get out of there," my father shouted back. "We'll send the capsule back for you." "Sorry, boss," he replied, raising his voice over the sound of rending metal and laser fire. "It looks like we're going to have to make our last stand right here." He said something else, but it was drowned out by an explosion. All of the video feeds to the Thunderdome on our Q-coms went dead, but we could still hear audio. "Godspeed, old friends," Shin said a second later, shouting to be heard over the chaos unfolding around him. My father tried to reply, but he couldn't get any words out. He nodded, then I saw his face contort into a mask of pure anguish just before he buried his face into his hands. "Hey, do me a favor too, will you guys?" Milo added. "After we win this war, tell everyone back home in Philly that my last request was to have my old high school named after me, okay? My mom went there too, and I think she'll really like that, you hear me?" I took my father's Q-com and answered him. "Yeah, Milo," I said. "Sure thing. We'll take care of it." "Thanks, man," he replied. "Cushmaster High School. I love it." He laughed maniacally again, and I could hear that he was still relentlessly firing his laser turret. "Oh, wait! One other thing! Tell them to erect a bronze statue of me in downtown Philly, just like the one they made for Rocky, but make mine bigger than his, okay?" Before I could reply, another explosion rocked the base, distorting the Q-com's audio channel. This explosion sounded far louder than the previous one. "Shit! Shit, shit, shit!" we heard Shin yell. "Here they come, Milo! Brace yourself!" "Come get some!" I heard Milo shouting, his voice strangely gleeful. I could hear the sound of him rapidly firing his Q-com's wrist laser. "Who wants some? From hell's heart, I stab thee, assholes! By Grabthar's hammer, you shall—" Milo's voice was drowned out by another series of massive explosions, followed by what sounded like a hailstorm of incoming enemy laser fire, and by the terrible hurricane-like howl of the Thunderdome being breached and depressurized as its atmosphere and everything else inside was sucked up and out into the dark vacuum outside the lunar surface. But the silence that followed was somehow even worse.